Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. My name is Anora Wang. Today's topic is, what have we learned from empirical studies? Potential antitrust concerns arising from serial acquisitions. Joining me today is my co-host, Derek Jackson. Hi, Derek.
Hi, Anora.
Derek, what are serial acquisitions and why are we discussing this topic?
So, serial acquisitions, which are also sometimes called roll-ups, are corporate strategies that involve growth through buying several smaller firms in the same industry or sector. Antitrust enforcers have begun to pay attention to serial acquisitions and raising the concern that companies may amass market power through a series of acquisitions which by themselves may be too small to merit antitrust scrutiny. Private equity firms in particular have frequently engaged in this strategy, although as we'll talk about a bit today, it's not limited to that context. So today we will be asking the question, what does the empirical evidence actually tell us about the impact of serial acquisitions on the markets?
Who do we have the pleasure to talk with today?
Today our guest is Dr. Paul Eliason. Dr. Eliason is an associate professor of economics at the David Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Paul's interests include empirical industrial organization and public economics with a focus on healthcare, and he holds a PhD in economics from Duke University. As an economist, Dr. Eliason examines how economic incentives shape healthcare provision and outcomes in the U.S. and explores the potential effects of proposed policy interventions. His current projects examine consolidation and physician ownership of medical facilities, as well as how to combat fraud in healthcare. We're particularly interested to talk to Paul today about his 2019 study, How Acquisitions Affect Firm Behavior and Performance, evidence from the dialysis industry, which was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics and has really become one of the most frequently cited works on this topic. We're very lucky to get to speak to Paul today and get his insights on serial acquisitions and talk to him about his own research and the additional research that's been done over the years in this area by himself and others.
And without further ado, Paul, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Paul, I know we're going to some depth today since it's economics and it's like empirical studies. So why don't we offer our listeners a little bit of like a roadmap? What are we going to talk today? First, I think you're going to give us a little bit of like overview of the landscape of the economic studies in serial acquisitions. And then in relation to like precise channels through which mergers and acquisition would ultimately lead to changes in prices and qualities, right? Which is the most important to who are listening to this. And then we're going to focus a little more on your dialysis study. So why don't we start with the basics? How do you define serial acquisitions and why it could be an issue of competition from an economist's perspective?
Yeah, sure. So I think Derek provided a pretty good definition. I think serial acquisitions, they are strategies that involve a flurry of usually relatively smaller acquisitions. They're not always that small, but that's kind of the hallmark. You often see them in industries that are composed of lots of small competitors, and they potentially serve to consolidate what used to be fragmented markets. So you see them all over the place. I was thinking about this the other day, and last year I had to replace my HVAC unit. And I was calling around all the HVAC installation shops, and I found out they had basically all been bought by one firm. Interestingly, some were operating under their old business name. Some had a new name, but they all kind of had the same owner. And so it's really one of the hallmarks of how a lot of industries in the U.S. have been evolving over recent years.
And what are some of the economic rationales? Why would a private equity firm or another actor be interested in engaging in this type of strategy?
Yeah, so I think you could kind of put the rationales in two buckets. One, I just think of as strategic rationales. These are things like it can allow them to achieve economies of scale, right? You take all these, what used to be small firms, you combine them into one big firm. Now you can share best practices more efficiently within the firm. You can centralize a lot of the fixed costs, billing, administration costs. You also can achieve greater bulk, like purchasing power. So you can drive down your costs through these economies of scale fairly effectively. On the other side, and probably what the most concern is centered on, is you can achieve market power, right? By doing these serial acquisitions, you're both expanding your own presence as well as eliminating competitors. That has some obvious concerns related to pricing or even quality of goods being produced. The other bucket I think of as being, sometimes it's just called valuation arbitrage, right? Especially private equity firms, like they see these opportunities where you can buy up little firms, and then the value of the combined entity is greater than the sum of the parts, and so you can then sell it at higher multiples than what you got it.
Right, like consumers would trust a bigger brand, essentially.
Sure.
But what are some economic arguments or rationale against serial acquisitions?
Yeah, well, so the big one is kind of what I mentioned before, is market power, right? So market power allows firms to essentially, extract, the surplus that used to go to consumers and take it home as profits. This is usually through reduced price competition. It can also be something about the products that they're making is changing. So I study healthcare, so we're very concerned about the quality of care that patients receive. And if there's less competition, there's going to be less discipline on the firms in the market. And I think it's important to note that these effects, you don't always see them in the short run, right? Some of them are going to be things that are realized in the future, right? So when these markets consolidate, it can be increasingly difficult for new entrants to start up. And so maybe in the future you have less competition. They can also reduce incentives to innovate and develop new products or improve on what you're currently doing. So those are some of the main concerns. There's also this other channel of concerns that it could be that there's something about the fundamentals of the acquiring firm that it's undesirable for those practices to spread. It could be bad for consumers or in our case, patients for some reason. And when you get these sorts of acquisitions, often those practices are transferring to the acquired firms, and that can be harmful. So for example, the example I hear most is with private equity. And a lot of people are express concerns that private equity is overly focused on achieving high returns over relatively short periods, right? They want to get in, they want to exit in 3 to 7 years. And that kind of short-termism raises concern for some people, what that might mean for the businesses that are being traded in these transactions, as well as the consumers.
Paul, what does the economic landscape look like around this in terms of what sorts of studies have been done? Has there been a focus on particular industries, or are there industries where this is a more prominent issue?
Yeah, there has been a focus on particular industries. My little sliver of economics is industrial organization, which I'm sure some of your listeners are familiar with. Our tradition is we tend to focus on industries because we think the specifics of industries often matter for the consequences of some sort of economic phenomenon or strategy. We think regulation matters. We think consumer choice and how it works matters. Are consumers well informed about the quality of the product they're purchasing? Or with healthcare, are they well about the prices? Because that's not always transparent. What do cost structures look like on the supply side? It's important to understand these specifics of each industry. And so a lot of the research is kind of specific. So there's quite a bit in healthcare, and I think there's a lot of serial acquisitions in healthcare as well. But even within healthcare, it's kind of focused on subsectors, right? We study dialysis. There's some good work about IVF clinics, anesthesiologists. There's quite a bit on hospitals. One reason why there's so much research in healthcare is because the data is actually richer there than it is in a lot of the economy, right? So I talked about the HVAC repair people, which I think that matters a lot because I had to pay a lot for this HVAC. But there's just not, the data there is a lot more difficult to come by because we don't have, all these big payers, and the federal government's not taking an interest. And so there's a real lack of data in a lot of places. But you do see some work in education. You see some work in restaurants. There are some little slivers where you have a nice little view into what's going on here.
And beyond sort of the data that's available in particular industries, are there features of certain industries that make them more attractive to serial acquisitions or more susceptible to that?
Yeah, I think a big one is industries that are highly fragmented, right? So industries where there's a lot of small firms, and these often can be service industries or industries where like travel costs matter quite a bit, right? Because that's how you end up with these kind of localized markets that are really prime targets for this. And that's not universally true. You'll see examples that, buck that trend, but that's where you most often will see this.
So how did you form your approach to serial acquisition issue? And I know we sort of gave it away that you focus a little bit on the channels and mechanisms leading to changes, but does that also reflect a general lack of focus on this before your study? Tell us a little bit, how did you decide on the focus of your study?
Yeah, so before we started this study, I was interested in this phenomenon of serial acquisitions, and I was interested in healthcare industries generally. And when I read the research that existed at the time, I was struck by kind of two things, I would say, two weaknesses as I perceived it. One was most of the research is really looking solely at the consolidation effect. So a lot of the research kind of boils down to taking some measure of concentration of an industry, like HHI is common, but there are others, and correlating that with some market outcome that we care about, prices, for example. Right. And you can see, when concentration goes up, if prices go up, probably there's something anti-competitive going on there. But it fails to break down the precise mechanisms through which these changes are occurring. So what are the firms actually doing differently? The other thing it fails to break down is that correlation. Is that coming from competition, or is it coming from a more general ownership phenomenon, right? Is it just that firms with higher prices are buying up all these little firms, and that's why prices are going up? And so I wanted to answer some of those questions, and I wanted to do it in healthcare. I actually did look into a couple of other industries first. I settled on dialysis for a couple of reasons. One is it's kind of an outlier in terms of the extent to which it's been rolled up. So if you go back a couple of decades to the 90s, about 20% of dialysis clinics were owned by chains, like national chains. Today, if you look at it, it's like 80%. So we've gone from 20 to 80% over the last 3 decades. And so that's a starker example of roll-ups, I think, than you see in a lot of places. So we have like the natural experiment. And most of that, or at least a lot of that consolidation, is coming from acquisitions of little independent dialysis clinics. It used to be that they were largely owned by local hospitals or physicians or just entrepreneurs, things like that.
And just to be clear, this is the US market for outpatient dialysis, right? So people go in and out of the clinic, right? Not like, hospitalized and using a dialysis machine in hospital, right?
So that's another point and reason why I wanted to focus on this industry is because this is the outpatient market for dialysis. There's about 500 in the US that rely on this to stay alive, and they need to get treatment 3 times a week. So the fact that you have a patient going repeatedly to this location is a really nice thing for research designs. Whereas at hospitals, it shows up once and then like maybe never again. What we can actually do because we have that repeated contact is we can look at the same patient in the same facility, and we can look at how their care differed before and after an acquisition. A really comparison. And it's with observational studies, it's usually difficult to find comparisons.
And there are apparently some other distinct advantages in focusing on this industry. Could you tell us a little bit more about those advantages? Like, in relation, maybe like, type or amount of data points that you can gather?
Yeah. So first I'll say, I don't know if this is an advantage or a point of interest, but this is a larger industry than most people expect. I mentioned there's 500,000 patients. There's about 7.5 of these clinics. So the number you hear, or the comparison you hear, is that's the same number of Taco Bells in the US. So if you think about any of those you have around, you probably have a similar amount of clinics around you. And it's a very expensive sector, right? So Medicare actually pays for most dialysis. It's considered a disability that gets people qualified for Medicare. And while it's only 1% of Medicare beneficiaries, it's north of Care's budget. We used to say that it's 1% of the entire federal budget was paying for dialysis care. Full disclosure, I'm not sure how that has kept up post-pandemic because our budget has changed a lot. But it's a significant share, right, of spending. In 2020, it was $50 billion is what we're spending on this care. So it's a lot. There's a lot of money in it. And because of that, the federal government has been keeping really close tabs on these patients through data collection a long time. And they make, who can show they have a good reason to use it. For example, not only do they have insurance claims, right? So you can see what money is being spent at these facilities. And you can use those claims to construct things like hospitalizations or was somebody hospitalized because they got an infection at a dialysis clinic. But on top of the claims, they actually have this whole surveillance system where they collect data for all patients, whether they're on Medicare or not, at the point of care. And this data includes things like blood chemical tests that assess dialysis treatment. A lot of them are anemic. We might talk about this more later, but there's measures of like how anemic patients are. And so it's hard to find that kind of data even within healthcare. So the fact that we could see with such granularity the patients are receiving these repeated encounters made it pretty uniquely ideal.
So there's,
for this kind of
in the dialysis space, really sort of fairly objective measures of the quality of care that I imagine are probably difficult to get in other healthcare. So exactly. What did your study ultimately find? Yeah. You've documented sort of the rapid change in the structure of the market over a series of decades. What did you find was the effect of that change?
Yeah. So broadly speaking, we basically found that after being acquired, these facilities, they made changes to their operations that are consistent with cutting costs, right, and increasing revenue, right? So profitability really went up quite a bit. So on the cost, for example, we saw that acquired facilities, they substitute away from high-skilled workers to lower-skilled workers. And they treat more patients per worker, more patients per dialysis station. So a station is kind of like a measure of how much physical capital these clinics have. And then on the revenue side, we saw that they changed their operations to increase their revenues, right? So they were treating more patients at each facility. So as you treat, the more revenues. Also, striking result we have is we saw that they changed how they treated patients in order to boost revenue from Medicare or reimbursement from Medicare. And you see this really pronounced in their drug dosing strategies. They substitute towards more generously reimbursed drugs and away from reimbursed drugs. Now, it's important to note that it's not immediately clear that these changes are bad, right? These firms could just be more productive, right? They can use the same inputs or even less inputs, treat patients and achieve the same level of quality of care. So we dig into that as well. And on almost every metric, we see, things like survival, hospitalizations, some of these blood chemical tests I was telling you about, we can observe directly in the data. On almost every metric, we see quality seems to degrade these costs.
Let's take a step back and just to sort of give a little bit of high level view of what really happened in terms of the scale and extent of the acquisition that happened in this industry in the past, I'd say 2 to 3 decades.
Today, if you look at the dialysis industry today, about 70% of these facilities are owned by just 2 firms, right? DaVita and Fresenius. They're 4 publicly traded firms. They have reached that market dominance through 2 things. And they've also built some of the facilities, right? We are specifically, in our study, we're specifically looking at the acquisitions. And we're even more granularly than that, we're looking at the acquisitions of independently owned dialysis facilities. So we're not looking at them buying other chains, some of that. But over about 2 decades, there were about acquisitions of single, independently owned clinics. And so we're actually studying those clinics, right? Process additions or building new centers, market, and really flip the ownership, right, from being 20% chain owned to being less than 20%.
And did your study show that prior to those acquisitions happening, did independent clinics tend to perform better than the large chains?
Acquired quality was better. One place we can really dig into this in a really fine way is looking at the drug practices that were happening at the clinic before acquisition and after acquisition. So most dialysis patients, especially at the time, were treated for anemia, right? They had too few cells. And so they're given a cocktail of drugs that stimulates red blood cells. One of these drugs in particular is called EPO, or epogen alpha. If it sounds familiar, it might be because you're into cycling. So this was but it has a real clinical use in dialysis. And one of the really striking results we saw was that EPO doses in these patients nearly doubled in like 2 months after a facility was acquired by a chain. And the question then is, well, maybe they were being underdosed before, right? But we have how much hemat in there, and we can take that and compare it to the clinical standards at the time. And it turns out that the effect of this increase in drug dose is actually just to push their hemoglobin levels up above, beyond what the clinical standards are at the time. So they're being overdosed. And the clinical standards are what they are because there are health risks to overdosing. And those health risks include things like being hospitalized for cardiac event, things like that. And we can actually also see that these patients that experience this really large increase in dosing, they also experience a significant increase in risk of being hospitalized for those same causes, which on this dimension, their treatment was better before these clinics were acquired. And it got worse at the same time the taxpayers started paying more money.
In antitrust bar, we obviously are interested in the question whether your study and any findings stem from it explain anything or say anything about market power, and whether market power is the driving force for these changes that you have observed. And I think that's one of the specific area that you have focused on in your study.
Yeah, so we want to know where these are coming from. That's what this question really is. Is this coming from market power, or is it coming from something else? And what we did is we looked at facilities located in geographic markets where the acquisition didn't change the competitive landscape. Right, so think of a small town that only has one dialysis clinic in it, and that clinic is acquired by a chain. The ownership of that clinic changed, but the competitive landscape of that market didn't change. Right, there was only one. There was a monopoly before, and there's still a monopoly. And so what we do is we look at those monopoly acquisitions and we compare them to acquisitions that take place. There were maybe 3 or 4 different facilities. In those markets with 3 or 4 facilities, the acquisition can actually change the competitive landscape. And surprising to us, we actually saw very similar results in the competitive market versus the monopoly market, suggesting that at least some of this effect, right, is coming just from competition, right? But something about the actual ownership itself and adopting the practices of the acquiring firm was causing it. Now, we can't fully rule out, right, that we can't say competition doesn't matter at all from that result. And there are some more recent papers that look at this and do find meaningful impacts there. But it certainly isn't totally a safe competition here.
I think there is also a concept of whether you're looking at a chain of clinics and now they're negotiating with insurer or who is the payer somehow, even though they're still the monopoly in the same town, but they're larger in a greater region. How do you see that angle?
I think that's a really big part of what's going on here. So one of the limitations of this paper that I'm discussing right now is we don't look at prices because we're really focused on Medicare, which it's around 90% of patients are on Medicare. But this 10% margin that are patients with commercial or private insurance, they pay anywhere from 2 to 10 times as much as Medicare per treatment. So there's a lot of interest in being able to negotiate high rates, even though it's such a small part of the patient pool. And we actually have a paper that came out last month in JAMA Health Forum where we actually are able to look at prices. And they definitely are able to leverage these acquisitions into higher prices. It does not appear like that is happening on the local level. I think there's a lot of bargaining or negotiating between providers and insurers happens at a national level, right? Where you have the insurers trying to get a national network, right? You have like United Health Group, right? Trying to get their national network. And since these national chains, DaVita and Fresenius, are so large, it's very important that they're included in those networks. And so they seem to be able to capitalize that into getting higher prices as well.
Happy to hear that you have another recent publication. We're going to put the link to that if that's available to the public so people can access to your more updated or recent publication through our webpage. So we talked a little bit about the data that you looked at and given the nature, like, where it came from and when it came from, are there limitations resulting from the particular data that you looked at? Or maybe like, particular industry that you focused on, if we are talking about generalization?
Yeah, so for the industry, I'd say, we don't look at prices. That's a big one. The other one is the data that we were looking at are a bit dated, especially at this point. And so we end our study in 2011 because in 2011, Medicare just totally changed its reimbursement policy in this industry. And so we wanted to have some policy stability in what we were studying. And so, the last 10, 15 years, things may be different for sure. And then there's also the industry is a very specific industry. In particular, when we were trying to figure out why competition wasn't explaining too much of what we saw, we decided to study patients. And these patients, travel costs are very important to them because they have to go in to get treated 3 times a week. That seems to be so important that it just kind of trumps a lot of the other things you might think they're concerned about, such as the care they're receiving. We saw that when a facility was acquired, even though quality went down, patients rarely leave the facility and switch to another one, even when they have other options, right? So something about the nature of consumer choice here is maybe fairly specific and could explain why we see what we see here. And you might get different results in different industries.
And speaking of those different industries, I think you mentioned there have been a few subsequent studies in other industries, can you talk a little bit about those other industries and what those studies found?
So one that really pairs nicely with our study is one that came out last year by Ambar Laforgia and Julia Bodner. And they look at IVF clinics, right? So fertility clinics. Now, this is a very different healthcare setting than dialysis, in particular because most patients are paying up front out of pocket, right? They might get reimbursed for some of it later on, but they're paying a lot more out of pocket. And so there's a really interesting paper that came out last year, I believe, by Ambar Laforgia and Julia Bodner that pairs really nicely with our paper. And it is about IVF clinics, right? So fertility clinics. And IVF is a very different part of healthcare from dialysis. And it's different in a couple of ways. One is that patients tend to be paying out of pocket, at least at first. Sometimes they'll be reimbursed later by their insurer, but they're going to be a lot more price sensitive. And also they seem to be a lot more sensitive to quality and outcomes. So IVF chains or IVF clinics, they'll post data on their success rates, like their pregnancy success rates, things like that. And what they find is that IVF chains, actually, when they acquire, there's been a bunch of roll-ups there. And these roll-ups have actually led to improved pregnancy success rates and more competitive pricing. And the difference between what they find and what we find, I think, is really just this: the consumers are behaving very differently in these two settings, right? And consumer choice is really leading to a lot of discipline in IVF, and that discipline seems to be fairly muted in dialysis. So I think that's the most interesting comparison to our paper. I will also say that, like, across the board, there's been some emerging evidence that when private equity or other large chain corporations roll up a market, they do tend to be pretty effective in increasing prices. We see that, time and time again. And they also are effective at achieving highly visible and highly reported quality metrics, right? Now, where things seem to suffer is those things that are less visible. So another example that comes to my mind is in skilled nursing facilities. Right? Quality is all about the ratio of workers to resident days. And you want to have a lot of nurses and people around taking care of the patients, which makes sense. And those are almost always reported to the state and posted publicly. And what you see there is in markets that are competitive, the roll-up leads to higher worker to resident ratios, so improved quality. You don't see the same thing in less competitive markets. But that's a very salient form of quality. If you look at other less salient forms of quality, you don't see really that the increased worker to patient ratio is converting to other sorts of health outcomes that you may want.
That's all very helpful. And obviously, this is a developing area of study and research. So maybe you can offer some guidance to policymakers who are looking at this closely. Just to remind people, the DOJ and FTC in May 2024 jointly issued a request for information on serial acquisitions and roll-up strategies. So obviously, this is an area that's looked at by the policymakers. So Paul, you have any insights to shed on how researchers and policymakers should approach this issue going forward?
Oh, sure. I think it's a really tricky challenge, right? Because regulators, they have real constraints. And, the hallmark of this strategy is there are a lot of these deals. Some may be anti-competitive, some may not be anti-competitive. So I would say, first off, that any solution has to have a real component of data gathering or monitoring. There's some great work out there showing that antitrust regulators almost never get involved in deals where there's not some sort of pre-merger notification, or it doesn't happen very often, or there's not some sort of notification. And the nature of these serial acquisitions is they tend to be smaller, below the Hart-Scott-Rodino threshold. And so they often will fly under the radar. So there needs to be some sort of more creative approach, right, to monitoring it. I think that, it's possible this could be as simple as like keeping track of like all acquisitions in some way, shape, or form. That could be like data analytics driven to some degree, and flagging firms that appear to have a history of roll-ups. And then maybe for these flagged firms requiring some sort of prior notification from them in particular. The FTC is trying this, I think, in some way. I also sometimes wonder if this is a case where mandating divestitures might be fruitful, in some cases at least. I know there's a lot of hesitation to unscramble the egg. Certainly here it's not always appropriate, but the fact that many of these roll-up industries are fundamentally local industries, right? And they used to be characterized by small establishments. Some of them may be easier to unravel than others. This won't always be the case, right? But in some cases it might make sense. The other thing you said, like for researchers, I think there's more need, like a lot of this research is essentially trying to look at what's happening in the local market. And that's because there's natural comparisons that's really helpful, right? You look at a market that consolidates, you compare it to a market that didn't. But I suspect that a lot of the effects of serial acquisitions are best seen at a national level, right? Which is tricky research to do because you don't have a really natural comparison, but I think it's also important that we understand what's happening at that level, especially in healthcare for a lot of these roll-ups.
Sounds so great. Sounds like some of these projects might interest you and your research assistants as well, if you're a large enough team to look at those data. So since we have you, and let's switch gear a little bit, and we want to learn a little bit about you as a person as well, would you tell us a little bit about you as a person, and then that's something people would not know if they had only worked with you professionally?
Okay. I was going to say I have a 6-month-old, but the people who work with me professionally know that I'm sometimes very tired. So they probably actually know that. I am an amateur competitive jammer, actually, as in making jams and entering them into competitions.
Not the direction I thought you were going with that. I was thinking you were going to be talking about playing in a jam band or...
Oh, yeah. So I live in Salt Lake, and there's a district here called the Marmalade District. And every year they have a jam fest. But the keynote event of it is a jam competition, or preserve competition. They accept more than just jam. The last couple of years, I've been trying to win that, and I've been slowly working my way through the ranks. Last year, I got second place with my strawberry cardamom jam. And I think this is the year. So I've got high hopes.
What's the most unusual fruit that you or one of your competitors has made a jam out of?
Quince, maybe? So, which I think they did because there's like a street over there called Quince. So the whole district is like named after fruit trees because they used to have a bunch of orchards over there, including that. But a lot of the creativity is in the combinations that you see. You know, I think the one that won 2 years ago was a pineapple habanero jam.
Like a cocktail. I'm curious, like, since you said it's competitive, like, how do you really compare the competition? How is that measured against?
It's judges, right? It's judges. And I think that you get extra points for novelty, right? So I think if you submit the best strawberry jam in the world, you can't win with that. There needs to be something novel about it. The other thing is there's variation across jam competitions in what criteria matter. And actually a lot of them are all about what the jam looks like, right? So a lot of state fair jam winners, they win because, they cut the fruit into stars or something it looks really pretty. And so, yeah, it's kind of the Wild West. To answer that question, you got to figure out what your judges are after, really. So it's a repeated game.
Oh, very interesting. And then before we let you go, we do have a little bit of a silly segment called Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
So we do have a virtual hat that contains 20 questions, each corresponding to a number. If you tell us a number of your choice, we'll give you a random question that's associated with that. That's sort of just another chance for us to get to know you a little bit more or something like that. 17. The question is, if you were given $50,000 on the condition that you had to spend it all in 1 hour, what would you buy?
Can I pay down my wife's student loans? If that's an option, that's what I would do. If you want something more creative, I would probably buy a car with 4-wheel drive so I can drive up the canyons in the winter, which in Utah is a big thing.
Not going to invest in some more jamming equipment or,
I
don't know. I could spend $50,000 on that. I could spend $100.
Or some novel fruit, right, for jam competition. Well, it's all very, very wholesome, I think.
Yeah, I'm very practical, as you can tell.
Thank you for joining us. We learned a little about your personal life, but a lot on serial acquisitions. So it's a pleasure, and we hope to learn from you again in the future on this topic or on some other topics. And listeners, thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.